Last winter, I found myself sharing a table with a veteran Indo-Pacific strategist at a dimly lit bar just a few blocks from the Pentagon. He was practically vibrating with confidence, tapping his tablet screen where a map of the Himalayas was lit up in these really aggressive red and blue colors. "This is it," he whispered, leaning in like he was sharing some kind of state secret. "India is finally our democratic spearhead. The border conflict is the glue that brains them to us. There's no turning back for New Delhi now." And he looked so satisfied, like a man who had just seen the final piece of a global puzzle click perfectly into place. He kept talking about shared values and the democratic arc as if they were, physical laws of gravity or something. But then his phone buzzed. A news alert popped up, December 24th, 2025. China and India had just announced a breakthrough, a concrete agreement on managing transboundary rivers and the restoration of ancient pilgrimage routes. The aggressive red zones on his map suddenly felt irrelevant. The strategist's face didn't just drop, it went completely blank. He started scrolling frantically, muttering about tactical maneuvers and temporary truces, but you could see the confusion in his eyes. He couldn't grasp how two ideological rivals could simply sit down and talk about water rights and mountain passes without asking for Washington's permission first. That look of pure, unadulterated bewilderment, it really stayed with me. It was the look of a man watching a script he'd spent a decade writing get tossed into a fire by the very actors he thought he controlled. He was still playing the game of democracy versus autocracy, while on the roof of the world, two ancient civilizations were playing a much older, much colder game of Asian realism. It makes you wonder, while the West is busy building these arcs of democracy on paper, is the rest of the world busy building something much more permanent out of concrete and water? And if that democratic encirclement was never actually real, what does that say about the people who told us it was inevitable?
That moment you described, that news alert from the roof of the world, it perfectly encapsulates this profound discontinuity that's reshaping global geopolitics right now. It didn't just challenge the prevailing Western script.
No, it disregarded it completely.
It acted as if the script didn't even exist.
And that script, as you say, has always been this battle of values, right? The democracy versus autocracy narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But this event we're focusing on, this incredibly pragmatic Sino-Indian agreement, it suggests a huge strategic shift, one where practical things like resource management and long-term civilizational stability are proving to be, infinitely more powerful than the abstract, value-based alliances the West is always pushing.
That's precisely the mission of this deep dive. We're going to analyze the rise of a new strategic framework. It's one that judges the world not by its political systems, but by its civilizational endurance. And this forces us to make a really difficult, but I think essential comparison. It's the efficiency of this civilizational state model in tackling huge generational challenges versus the systemic paralysis and political short-termism that we're seeing more and more in many Western political systems.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's lay the foundation with that core concept.
Yeah.
The civilizational state.
Right. It's a profound conceptual alternative to the nation-state model. We have to remember that the nation-state is, historically speaking, a pretty recent invention.
It's really a product of 19th century Europe, right? Built around language and ethnicity.
Exactly. It's built around linguistic and ethnic self-determination. The civilizational state operates on a completely different plane.
So it's not just a bigger nation state, it's philosophically different. So how do we actually define that difference?
We define it by its core claim. A civilizational state asserts that it represents not just a historical territory or an ethnic group, but a distinctive, unique civilization in its own right.
A whole civilization.
Yes. The emphasis is entirely on historical continuity. This deep cultural unity that transcends modern borders, spans huge geographic regions, and this is the key part, often counts its history in thousands of years.
That idea of deep time is so critical. I mean, if a state is measuring its own legitimacy in millennia, then a 4-year election cycle.
Or even a decade-long strategic plan from a Western power.
It becomes almost meaningless in comparison. It completely recalibrates what your priorities are.
It does. And the implications are fundamentally anti-universalist. This view argues that any attempt to define or impose universal human rights or common democratic standards
It's misguided.
At best, it's misguided. At worst, it's a new form of cultural imperialism.
And why is that, from their perspective?
Because, as they argue, each civilization requires political institutions and therefore political norms that specifically reflect its own unique culture, its own heritage, and its own values, not ones imported from somewhere else.
And now we can see how this framework gives this this ideological ballast to the major rising powers in Asia. Let's start with China. It seems like the most explicit example of this longevity claim.
China is, for its proponents, the absolute epitome of the civilizational state. Its history is viewed not in terms of, the modern People's Republic or even the last 150 years of turmoil.
No, it's seen as this continuous process, right? This cultural syncretism across vast dynasties.
Precisely. Its identity is rooted in a continuous philosophical and political tradition that they trace back thousands of years.
And this cultural continuity, it allows the state to adopt social and political norms that are just. They're radically different from the West. How does this specifically affect the relationship between the individual and the state?
It creates a fundamentally different social contract. China's identity, which is rooted in Confucian thought and very old administrative practices, it emphasizes the prioritization of society over the individual.
The collective comes first.
Always. Political norms are often based on familial relations, this hierarchy of responsibility and duty that starts with the family unit and extends all the way up to the state.
So the legitimacy of the government, of the ruling structure, isn't derived from an election every few years.
No, not from periodic elections or individual rights. It's derived from its continuation of this unique socio-political order and its role as the ultimate and, most importantly, the competent guardian of society.
So the state's mandate is just to ensure the civilization not only survives, but thrives. And the current governance structure is simply the most efficient vehicle for that very, very long-term project. I mean, that's a powerful justification for centralized power.
It is. Now, if we turn to India, we see a parallel, though a distinctly different application of the same civilizational claim. Political theorists who support the ruling party there, they strongly embrace this idea that India is not just a nation. It's a unique, distinct civilization.
Okay, so what specific cultural or historical elements do they point to define that distinctiveness, especially when they're contrasting it with the old, secular, post-colonial state?
They argue that post-colonial governance was mistakenly founded upon imported Western ideas, things like scientific socialism or a pure parliamentary secularism.
With the belief that these ideas were universally applicable.
Exactly. A high-profile minister, who was formerly a consultant, has argued this very explicitly. He said the foundation was flawed because it didn't reflect India's core reality. The new consensus is that heritage precedes the state.
Heritage precedes the state. That's a powerful phrase.
It is, and they often emphasize a unique spiritual or a faith-based view of the world, arguing that it requires political institutions built on indigenous cultural heritage, not the rational scientific view that's favored by the West.
But wait a minute. I mean, India is inherently diverse. Linguistically, religiously, regionally, so isn't trying to define the nation through one overarching, sometimes narrow, civilizational lens inherently destabilizing? I mean, that just flies in the face of everything Western pluralism preaches.
And that is the central political tension. But the argument from the civilizational state proponents is that the previous secular Western imported model failed to unify the nation effectively. The current discourse frames the revival of this unique culture and heritage as the essential act of true decolonization.
So they're arguing that genuine national strength can only be found by looking inward, not outward to Western templates.
Exactly.
And then we see a third distinct application of this framework in Russia.
Indeed. Ideologues around the administration have fully embraced the rhetoric of Russia as a distinct Eurasian civilization state. Their narrative is one of a really complex historical destiny, that Russia has absorbed characteristics from both the East and the West, resulting in this unique bipolar historical experience and a kind of hybrid mentality.
So it's not part of Europe that failed to modernize.
No, it's its own self-sufficient cultural sphere, a civilization unto itself.
I remember the source mentioning an advisor who described Russia as having finally ended these fruitless efforts to integrate with the West. What does that really signify?
It signifies the complete abandonment of the entire post-Soviet project, the project of trying to fit into the Euro-Atlantic security and value structure. The argument now is that after centuries of trying to be Western, Russia has realized its true identity is that of a charismatic, talented, beautiful, and importantly, a lonely half-breed civilization.
Structurally and philosophically distinct.
Right, and trying to conform to the West only ever led to weakness.
So the common thread then, weaving through Beijing, New Delhi, and Moscow, is this fundamental ideological rejection of universalism.
Precisely. They view the rise of their powers as proof that what the West calls universal values, these concepts like globalized liberalism, human rights, democracy, are actually just culturally specific Western values.
And they contend that demanding everyone else adheres to these values is what's actively inhibiting the revitalization of their own non-Western civilizations.
It's a radical inversion of the global narrative.
It really is. If the West sees itself as the indispensable guide to modernity, these movements see the West as the international elite, whose values are just a barrier that has to be overcome to achieve true greatness and civilizational restoration. This philosophical framework is incredibly powerful, but ideas only matter if they actually translate into policy. So how does this civilizational endurance model manifest in real-world decisions, especially in the context of geopolitical rivals like China and India?
It translates into what we're calling Asian realism. The recent diplomatic reset, those concrete agreements on transboundary rivers and pilgrimage routes, the very event that shocked your Pentagon strategists, is the perfect illustration of how this realism can supersede ideological conflict.
It's a purely pragmatic calculation then. The border tensions are real, nobody's denying that. But the core developmental needs of 2 billion people are just a far greater priority than sustaining a military standoff for symbolic reasons.
That is the core calculus. You have these massive core developmental projects, rapid industrialization, ensuring energy security, modernization that secures domestic stability, and they must be insulated from potential conflict. When the stakes involve sustaining national growth and capacity over decades, ideology and short-term posturing, they just have to take a backseat to stability and resource security.
And this is where that technical pragmatism becomes the ultimate measure of competence.
Exactly. Let's delve into that idea of technical pragmatism versus all the ideological noise. You mentioned the story of the hydrological engineer. I think that perfectly captures the conflict between Western analysis and Asian reality.
Right. So for years, the main narrative in Western strategic journals about the Brahmaputra or the Yolngsangpo in Tibet was this idea of inevitable water wars.
Yes. The fantasy was that China would inevitably weaponize the upstream flow to choke India's development, forcing some kind of massive conflict. And this narrative served the Western idea that the rivalry between them had to be eternal.
It's the ultimate zero-sum thinking, built on this abstract ideological conflict.
Absolutely. Now, contrast that with the reality of the hydrological engineer, a guy named Arpan, based in northeast India. He wasn't tracking tank movements. He was monitoring the erratic pulses of a massive river system that's vital to millions of people. And recently, he observed the data sharing channels, which had been frozen by political tension, suddenly come back online, just humming with activity.
So that's the restoration of functional technical protocol.
He wasn't receiving data on military disarmament. He was getting flow rates, sediment levels, rainfall patterns.
Survival critical information.
And that data, that real-time telemetry, is what allows downstream villages to be saved from unexpected flash flooding during the monsoon. This is the flesh of modernity in its most literal form.
It's state capacity executing a survival critical task.
The concrete reality of saving human lives and securing resources, all facilitated by these quiet, functional, technical agreements, creates a tangible bond and a shared interest that is infinitely stronger than any value-based alliance brokered in some distant capital.
Which suggests that for these Asian realists, 10,000 speeches on universal values are completely worthless compared to a single, functional technical protocol for sharing hydrological data.
That's it. Stability and resource security are the key metrics of true national interest. They define success not by some diplomatic victory, but by delivered competence.
And this focus on capacity and technical mastery seems intrinsic to the civilizational state model itself.
It is. The models rising in East and South Asia prioritize building the tangible sinews of power and prosperity. The dams, the railways, the functional data sharing frameworks. They're focused on building something permanent, which is in direct contrast with the West's increasing tendency to prioritize abstract ideological discourse, often at the expense of actual functional administrative capacity.
And this strategic decision by India and China also represents a forceful rejection of that Western containment script. It's regional actors reclaiming the right to set their own strategic temperature.
The failure of the containment strategy is undeniable at this point. I came across this account from a logistics coordinator who is working near the line of actual control. He described the atmosphere over the last decade as a high-pressure environment. The expectation, which was heavily reinforced by external powers, was that India was destined to serve as the eastern anchor of a Western-led containment of China.
That military tension was supposed to be the glue for a larger democratic alliance system. That's what the strategist told me.
That was the script written far, far away. But the logistics coordinator noted this decisive shift during the recent disengagement. Instead of doubling down on the military posturing, officials on both sides shifted their focus entirely towards strategic autonomy.
So they chose to bypass the Western script of eternal rivalry.
To secure a cold, hard peace that allowed both nations to reprioritize internal growth and modernization.
And that is the exact moment the democratic encirclement strategy failed. It wasn't defeated by force. It was just made irrelevant by a joint decision to prioritize internal and regional stability. These regional powers are basically declaring that they will decide their own borders and their own developmental paths. They're refusing to be pawns in someone else's ideological crusade.
Which inevitably leads to the reaction you described in your opening story.
Yeah.
The anxious peering of a declining civilization. The West, having based its entire strategic rationale on fostering division abroad to maintain its hegemony, finds itself unable to comprehend a non-confrontational civilizational order.
It's trapped in a mindset where rivalry is the only possible outcome. It struggles to understand strategic patience or long-term developmental priorities.
It can't process it.
The implication then is that while the West was focused on the political symbolism of these alliances, the Asian powers were focused on the practical reality of maintaining the capacity to build, to feed, and to manage their populations over centuries. That's a fundamentally different game.
And if Asian realism is the grand strategic manifestation, the engine that powers it is superior political efficiency and state capacity. The strategic planning within these civilizational states, whether it's for infrastructure, demographics, or economic transition, it operates on a generational timescale.
And that time horizon is just. It's utterly alien to political systems constrained by short electoral cycles.
That generational timescale immediately throws the systemic flaws of the West into sharp relief. What some analysts categorize as political decay and, more specifically, Vitocracy.
Vitocracy, that's the crucial concept here, isn't it?
It is. It describes a dysfunctional system where structural constraints, excessive checks, fragmented authority, political polarization, they prevent any single entity from acquiring enough power to make necessary long-term decisions.
It's defined by an abundance of veto points,
leading to chronic political paralysis.
And the United States, with its complex web of checks and balances, the Senate filibuster, judicial review, it serves as the unintentional model of this paralysis.
Precisely. The system actually encourages the judicialization of political processes.
Meaning critical policy decisions are often made in courts rather than through competent administrative governance.
Right. And special interest groups capture legislative outcomes, which results in massive complexity, sky-high transaction costs, and just crippling legislative gridlock.
And the practical result is a massive loss of state efficiency and momentum. The data is pretty stark. The sources show a sharp, measurable drop in the legislative success rate in the U.S. in the modern era.
It fell dramatically.
From around 7% to as low as 2%. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about the capacity to govern effectively.
And that dynamic becomes a vicious cycle. When the state performs poorly or it fails to deliver on crucial infrastructure or policy outcomes, it feeds public distrust.
And that distrust is then mobilized by political actors to justify even fewer investments in the state's administrative capacity.
Which further guarantees the state's eventual decay. It's a downward spiral.
Now, contrast that with the experience of policymakers operating within Asian capitals. That anecdote about the young policy researcher really highlights the cultural and structural chasm.
Right. Imagine a young, ambitious policy researcher. She graduates from a prestigious Western university in, say, London or DC, and she returns to an Asian capital. She arrives expecting to observe the inefficiency that Western academia often projects onto these non-Western systems.
But instead,
she finds herself not fighting for a 2-year budget extension, but designing a 30-year infrastructure master plan that connects major cities across multiple borders.
30 years. That is literally a lifetime project. It puts into perspective how utterly crippling a 4-year election-driven cycle truly is when you're facing complex challenges like climate change or massive infrastructure development.
She shared her deep frustration. In the West, getting a major project approved meant navigating this nightmare of local councils, environmental impact lawsuits, legislative reviews.
All of which could be killed by a single election cycle.
That is Vitocracy in practice, where the ability to obstruct is vastly superior to the capacity to build. In the Asian model, the emphasis is on technocratic governance, the ability to execute generational planning that survives the immediate whims of the political or news cycle.
So the Asian model treats the state not as a temporary prize to be won every few years, but as a permanent legacy to be built over centuries. The question really becomes whether the West's systemic political paralysis is a structural luxury that the modern world can still afford.
And this efficiency is not some philosophical accident. It is the deliberate result of unique governance engineering. To really understand the sophisticated mechanics of this capacity, we have to do a deep dive into Singapore, which has perfected technocratic governance and a very unique form of state capacity.
Singapore is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? It's consistently ranked among the world's freest economies by indices like the Economic Freedom of the World, the EFW. Yet it operates as a highly authoritarian state with extensive, almost unconventional market intervention. How do we resolve that contradiction?
Well, the contradiction only exists if you measure the state against the single ideal of laissez-faire capitalism. Western indices, they measure the magnitude of state intervention, but they completely fail to capture its strategic character.
So the Singaporean state keeps its bureaucracy and its tax structure relatively small, which reinforces that free economy image.
Right, but it wields immense, focused influence over the economy through non-traditional means.
So it's not about having a vast bureaucracy, but about highly efficient and targeted control.
Precisely. The first mechanism is meritocracy and efficiency. The state is intensely centralized and technocratic. This allows it to execute highly complex central economic planning,
including long-term industrial policy,
without the overhead of a bloated bureaucracy. And this capacity is sustained by high-performance legitimacy.
Because the state consistently delivers.
It delivers material well-being, trade surpluses, economic growth. It works.
Okay. And the second, more crucial mechanism is this near total control over what are called the strategic factor markets, land, capital, and labor.
That's the core of it. Control over these three strategic nodes gives the government just an outsized influence over all firms and all households.
So let's start with land. It's the foundational resource, especially on an island nation.
The state systematically monopolized physical space. Its ownership soared from about 25% in the mid-1960s to exceeding 90% today.
90%.
90. This was achieved through legislation like the Land Acquisition Act of 1966.
That 1966 Act was essentially the moment they codified the idea that foundational private property rights were secondary to state-led development goals.
It allowed the state to seize private land not just for traditional public use, but specifically for broad commercial and industrial purposes. And this foundational state control over space is then coordinated with long-term systematic planning. Most notably, the government's concept plan, which dictates land distribution for decades, ensuring physical engineering aligns perfectly with centralized economic objectives.
Okay, let's move to capital. How does a state that prides itself on low taxes manage to direct such massive capital flows?
It employs powerful extra-budgetary instruments that completely bypass traditional taxation. The most famous is the Central Provident Fund, or CPF.
The Mandatory Forced Savings Scheme.
Exactly. This centralization of capital flow allows the state to fund massive capital expenditures, domestic investments, and foreign reserves. They maintain deep control and ensure key infrastructure projects are funded, all while maintaining a fiscally conservative reputation that appeals to external investors. It's brilliant in a way.
And then there's the more subtle but maybe more pervasive mechanism of government-linked entities, the GLEs. These truly blur the line between public and private.
They do. These include government-linked corporations, GLCs, and real estate investment trusts, GL rights. They're technically held by Temasek Holdings, which is an investment company officially classified as a private entity, yet they operate de facto under state influence.
So Western indices just classify them as private.
They do, completely failing to capture their unique strategic role.
What is the sheer scale of this indirect state presence in the domestic economy?
It's staggering. Analysis shows that the GLEs make up, on average, 40.3% of the entire stock market capitalization.
Almost half the domestic economy is ultimately linked back to the state's long-term vision.
That means 2/5 of the strategic sectors are coordinated not by the open market alone, but by a powerful, centralized institutional category.
And that influence is particularly dominant in key strategic factor markets, especially real estate, you said.
Overwhelmingly so. The GL rights alone, which control massive commercial, office, and industrial property portfolios, occupied an average of 64.04% of the real estate investment trust sector during tracking periods.
So 2/3 of the sector.
And this overwhelming presence is concentrated in strategic areas: infrastructure, telecommunications, media. It underpins both economic and social control.
Finally, let's talk about labor. How does this system secure the necessary talent and ensure the disciplined workforce required for this long-term state project?
It's a highly sophisticated meritocratic system designed to create what you might call developmental workers. Firstly, the state uses highly targeted national manpower plans and incentives to direct the flow of talent into key strategic sectors, particularly STEM fields. Secondly, it offers extremely generous government scholarships, far more extensive than in most Western nations, to ensure that the absolute best talent is channeled directly into government agencies and those GLEs we just mentioned.
Which creates a self-sustaining political meritocracy. The state is constantly replenishing its own administrative and technical capacity with the best and brightest.
Furthermore, labor itself is institutionally disciplined. The state established the National Wages Council, which sets wages in line with national economic competitiveness within a carefully controlled tripartite approach.
And conventional industrial action is
virtually prohibited. The prevailing ideology, which is reinforced through education, is one of national survival. It demands a highly organized, disciplined citizenry geared towards productivity and self-sacrifice for the national interest.
So Singapore's model, then, it demonstrates a crucial point. State capitalism isn't a deviation or a failed version of the laissez-faire ideal.
Not at all. It is a distinct, highly efficient institutional category with its own internal logic and its own development trajectory, capable of generating sustained growth and challenging the universal applicability of Western liberal economics.
The superior efficiency and state capacity we just detailed, though, it requires an equally powerful ideological engine to gain mass political legitimacy.
Absolutely. And this is where authoritarian civilizational populism comes into play. It acts as the ideological glue binding that state capacity to mass identity.
And this populism serves multiple purposes. It doesn't just legitimize the current power holders. It actively constructs a national identity. It defines the people against external and internal elites. And it provides a potent, unified challenge to Western narratives of global order.
The core mechanism across all these states is drawing on nostalgia. They invoke a golden age of their civilization to justify a return to traditional values. They use religious, cultural, or unique civilizational identity to distinguish the people from internal secular elites, often characterized as westernized collaborators, and external liberal powers.
Let's look at China. How does an officially atheistic state utilize what is essentially a religious or cultural historical framework to legitimize its rule?
China employs a syncretistic approach. It's moving away from purely Marxist-Leninist justifications and toward cultural nationalism. The state actively encourages traditional beliefs and philosophy, especially Confucianism, to counter the persistent Western notion that China is somehow backward and undeveloped.
So the invocation of 5,000 years of continuous civilization is more than just a history lesson, it's a political assertion.
It is an assertion of superior political and cultural maturity. This longevity legitimizes the ruling party by portraying it not merely as a political organization, but as the inevitable successor.
The one leading the civilization toward the zenith of its power and influence.
A zenith that was supposedly disrupted by a brief period of Western domination. The narrative frames the current political order as the necessary defense of this unique, continuous history against Western disruption.
Okay, moving to Russia. How does the narrative of the Eurasian state civilization translate into populist ideology and at both internal unity and external opposition?
Russia uses the state civilization discourse to foster kinship among its diverse peoples without resorting to forced Russification. But most critically, the regime positions the country as the conservative defender of traditional moral and cultural values on a global scale.
So their struggle in this narrative is one against the godless and decadent liberal West.
Precisely. They emphasize that their traditional Orthodox Christian culture and family values are under existential threat from Western liberal ideology, which is portrayed as corrosive and destabilizing.
And that framing justifies two things at the same time: strict internal social control and aggressive external foreign policy maneuvers.
Exactly. It provides an all-encompassing, morally charged rationale for the government's choices, positioning the state as the ultimate bulwark against global decadence. It gives a sense of moral purpose to their strategic autonomy.
Finally, we have to look at India, where the civilizational claim is centered on a specific religious identity, Hindutva.
Here, the ruling party defines Indianness primarily through a Hindu identity. This framework casts the previous elite, the secular, English-speaking, Western-oriented intellectual class, as historical internal oppressors. The political movement frames the removal of this old secular establishment as a long overdue act of decolonization and liberation, which is essential for civilizational restoration.
So populist leaders are positioned as the champions of the people, tasked with overcoming these historical oppressors and restoring Hindu cultural hegemony.
And this is the ideological fuel for the governance model. It provides the necessary mass support and moral certainty to execute these long-term, structurally transformative policies that might otherwise face crippling Vitocracy in a more decentralized, ideologically fragmented system. This ideological push provides the cohesion required for that state capacity to truly function without perpetual obstruction.
So what unites all three of these approaches, the syncretism in China, the conservative defense in Russia, and the cultural restoration in India, is the consistent message aimed directly at the West.
Yes. The shared ideological goal is a deliberate reframing. They seek to portray Western concepts like liberalism, cosmopolitanism, and universal values as foreign impositions that have historically disempowered their societies. And by shedding these universal values, they aim to revive the indigenous political, cultural, and spiritual values that they believe historically empowered their respective civilizations.
They're asserting that Western norms are ill-suited and actively inhibit their rise to great power status.
And if we return one last time to that powerful opening story, the Sino-Indian cooperation on concrete issues like transboundary river management, it confirms that the old ideological containment strategies have, for the most part, failed. The world is visibly moving toward a synergy of civilization states that prioritize enduring national interests over ideological purity.
The strategic discipline required to execute 30-year infrastructure plans, the masterful control exerted through Singaporean technocracy, and the ideological consistency provided by civilizational populism. It all collectively demonstrates that this model possesses a distinct dimensional advantage in tackling long-term, complex geopolitical and developmental challenges.
These powers are operating on a historical generational clock. They are prioritizing state capacity, internal stability, and long-term material progress above the kind of short-term ideological posturing and military brinkmanship that so often captivates Western media.
The overwhelming lesson for anyone observing this global transition is the undeniable supremacy of state capacity and civilizational endurance. The West's script of democratic encirclement hasn't just been challenged, it's been actively tossed aside by actors focused on building something concrete and permanent. The global political gravity has definitively shifted, leaving the old ideological narratives in the twilight, struggling to explain a world that simply stopped listening.